Okay, I think we're live. So today I wanted to go over Surah 80, and this is an interesting surah for a number of reasons. One, because it shows the character of Muhammad, the person whom Muslims seek to emulate and whom they believe to be the perfect man. But also, it shows the distinct lack of any supernatural ability. This is someone who Muslims, if you really dive deep into their philosophy, into the Islamic tradition, particularly the Hadith, it's someone Muslims attribute almost supernatural powers to. Someone whose sweat has a miraculous or prophylactic property, whose blood, who people cling to according to Islamic tradition because he has some sort of miraculous abilities. But this demonstrates. But if anything, this sort of demonstrates the complete opposite. It's entitled "He Frowned," and in the Arabic, it's Surat Abasa. So it takes the title from an encounter Muhammad has, and I'm going to describe that encounter in a second. But let's just begin. It starts with the Bismillah, and the first verse, which is where the title is taken from, says, "He frowned and turned his back." Now, there's a Sunni tradition and a Shia tradition for this surah. So Sunnis believe that Muhammad was conferring with a group of pagan Arab chiefs whom he was trying to proselytize and persuade to accept Islam, and that he was interrupted by a blind man. Now, it's interesting because the Sunni or Orthodox view of this surah is a lot less favorable to Muhammad than the Shia interpretation. According to the Shia, Muhammad was not the one who frowned. It was um, it was a man from the Banu Umayya tribe, one of the tribes that he was trying to persuade to accept Islam, and he frowned because he didn't like blind people or people who were dirty or beggars. And the Shia view tries to craft a situation where Muhammad is actually the good guy. But that's not the Orthodox view. The Orthodox Sunni interpretation of this is Muhammad was approached by a blind man who might have been one of his followers, or might have been someone who wasn't a Muslim. There are disputes as to what his what his belief system was at the time. But basically, he was approached by a blind man, and let's see what happens. He frowned and turned his back. Now, keep in mind, this is Muhammad, at, at least according to the Orthodox traditional view of this surah. So he frowned and turned his back because there came to him the blind man. And what would make you know that he would purify himself or become reminded so that the reminder should profit him? Now, keep in mind, Muslims view physical infirmities, they view diseases, natural occurrences as some sort of punishment from Allah. So this is why you had a a bunch of Muslims who attacked Nabil Qureshi after he uh, during the time when he had stomach cancer. They attacked him and said this was Allah cursing him for abandoning Islam, even though these same people don't view Ahmadiyas as Muslims to begin with. But putting aside that contradiction, they said he was being cursed because he accepted Christ. And the idiocy of this view is apparent when you actually read the Bible. When if Muslims had taken the time to actually read, say, the book of Job or read the Gospels, uh, they would understand that someone isn't physically cursed by God, because of something they do. That someone developing a disease or someone who was born with a genetic deformity. These aren't God cursing someone for their lack of faith. It's in fact a result of our natural fallen state. We don't have perfect bodies, and it's ironic because if you use the same idiotic standard that Muslims use, you would have to say that Muhammad was cursed because he died in excruciating agony from a um, from eating poisoned lamb from his own stupidity, but also he died over the course of 3 years in agonizing misery. And in fact, his wife said that she had never seen anyone who was that um, who was that tortured on his death. So the ineluctable conclusion there is that Muhammad himself was cursed. If these are simply a result of Allah being displeased with people, and the same thing goes for Ahmed Deedat, who was a famous Muslim preacher, and he was just the typical Muslim apologist, just employed all sorts of sophistry, and he lost his voice for about a decade before he died, just at when he was at the apex of his popularity. So if you're going to use the Muslim standard, you would have to say that Ahmed Deedat was also cursed by Allah. But this is something that Muslims believe. They actually believe that, like, if someone is diseased, someone contracts a disease, if someone is has a genetic marker for disease like Huntington's or Tay-Sachs, that these are all signs of God cursing someone. So when it says here, uh, you have to keep this in mind when Muhammad sees a blind man. Obviously, he cursed, and this is one of the areas where Muhammad and Islam are very similar to the Pharisees. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. Those those encounters in the Gospels when the Pharisees believed that these people who were blind, who were lepers, that these were all people who were cursed by God. And of course, Jesus worked his miracles in order to demonstrate that this was simply another way for him to magnify God and to show um, God's glory. The fact that he could heal all of these people, it wasn't a result of God being displeased or cursing someone. The fact that they were leprous or deaf or blind, but Muslims hold to the Pharisaical view. So they were very similar to Pharisees in that sense, not in the sense that they had an understanding of the law, because of course, I mean, the Pharisees were very well steeped in the law. They actually understood to a large degree the Torah and the law and the prophets, even though they were blinded to how Jesus fulfilled them. They still had a very deep understanding, which is something that Muhammad did not. But he was very similar to the Pharisees in the sense of he believed that these physical infirmities and debilities were somehow God cursing these people. So you have to keep that in mind when you're reading this surah. So in 5, it says, "As for him who considers himself free from need of you, to him do you address yourself. And no blame is on you if he would not purify himself. And as to him who comes to you striving hard, and he fears, from him will you divert yourself. Nay, surely it is an admonishment. So let him who pleases mind it in honored books, exalted, purified." Now, contrast this with how Jesus deals with the blind. And if you go to Mark chapter 9, there's actually a great example of this. Um, there's actually a great example of this. So in Mark chapter 9, chapter 8 rather, and verse 22, it says, "And he came to Bethsaida, and they bring him a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. After that, he put his hands his eyes and made him look up, and he was restored and saw every man clearly. And he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell it to any in the town. And Jesus went out and his disciples into the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And by the way, he asked his disciples, saying unto them, whom do men say I am? So in this encounter, Jesus, well, there are a couple of interesting things about this. The fact that he leads him out of the town. Now, Bethsaida was the town, one of the towns that had hardened its heart, and people were resisting Jesus and resisting the acknowledging that he was the Messiah. So he took him out of the town before he healed him, but he also had a personal relationship. He didn't just snap his fingers and eliminate his blindness. This is the type of thing that Muslims would expect from God. God doesn't have any sort of personal relationship with creation. He doesn't have any communion with man. God in the Islamic worldview, God is completely remote and separate. There's no need for him to come down into humanity. Hi, Irene. Hi, MVD. There's no need for him to come down into humanity to atone for the sins of man, because man, there is no original sin, for one, and two, he doesn't have a relationship with man. So this is why Muslims say, well, why did Jesus have to die? Why did he why did his son have to be crucified and serve as a propitiatory atonement? And there are a number of answers to that question, but one of them is the fact that he needed to serve as a sacrifice for the sins of man. And that connection between man and God was severed. And the only way he could restore that was to come down in the body of a man and fulfill the prophecy outlined in the book of Genesis. But here you also see Jesus, how tactile he is. He's actually he's not just restoring someone. He's not just healing someone, but he actually has his hands. He's connecting. He's touching the man that he created. He's touching this man who for whom Jesus is the Savior. And this is something that would be completely foreign to Muhammad and completely alien to the concept of Islam. And you see this again in chapter 9. And this is a great response to the Muslim, this very retrograde type of idea that someone needed to have sin for them to be experiencing a physical ailment. So in chapter 9 of the Gospel of John, and as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. So this is why he was put there. And the fact that he was there meeting Jesus, this was just this was predestined so that Jesus could manifest the power of God. It had nothing to do with any sins that he or his family had committed. So in 4 it says, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way therefore and washed, and came seeing. The neighbors therefore, and they which before had seen him that he was blind, said, Is not this he that sat and begged? Some said, This is he. Others said, He is like him. But he said, I am he. Therefore said they unto him, How were thine eyes opened? He answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes, and said unto me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed and received sight. Then said they unto him, Where is he? He said, I know not. They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind, and it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then again the Pharisees who asked him how he had received his sight, he said unto them, He put clay into mine eyes, and I washed, and I do see. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. They say unto the blind man again, What sayest thou of him? And he hath opened thine eyes. He said, He is a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind, and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, Is this your son, who ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that it is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not, or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age. Ask him, he shall speak for himself. These words spake his parents, because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, He is of age, ask him. Then again they called the man that was blind, and said unto him, Give God the praise, as we know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, Whether he be sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. So that was a very lengthy passage, but basically it demonstrates the fact that sin, someone's suffering in this life, has nothing to do with, or doesn't necessarily have to do with some sin they've committed. Um, uh, if you've read the book of Ecclesiastes, you'll understand that the fact that, you know rain falls upon the just and the unjust. There's no there's no special hallowed category that people who are faithful to God are put in, which exempts them from earthly calamities and earthly troubles. But this was something that uh, that Muhammad did not understand. So in verse 13, I said, "In honored books, exalted, purified, in the hands of scribes." Now, keep in mind the Quran was not produced until hundreds of years after Muhammad's death. So this idea that the Quran is infallible, that it has no error, that it's divinely created, is simply discredited by looking at the historical facts. And the scribal errors you can find in the Quran are numerous, and they're not simply transcription errors that you see by copyists with the Gospels, or with the Old Testament, the books of Isaiah. These aren't simple transcription errors, or what you would call today typos. These are specific errors that go to the heart of Islamic doctrine and expose the fact that the Quran is an incredibly flawed book. So in 16 it says, Noble, virtuous, cursed be man, how ungrateful is he? Of what thing did he create him? Of a small seed he created him, then he made him according to a measure. Again, a seed, clay, dust, a clot of blood. There are so many different explanations for what man is made of, and Muhammad never seems to resolve it. And 20 says, Then as for the way, he has made it easy for him. Then he causes him to die, then assigns to him a grave. Then when he pleases, he will raise him to life again. Keep in mind, Muhammad was also facing Arabs who doubted the idea of a bodily resurrection. And 23, it says, Nay, but he has not done what he bade him. Then let man look to his food, that we pour down the water, pouring it down in abundance. Then we cleave the earth, cleaving it asunder. Then we cause to grow therein the grain. So, and he's simply describing natural processes, geological processes. and grapes and clover, and the olive and the palm, and thick gardens, and fruits and herbage, a provision for you for your cattle. But when the deafening cry comes, the day on which a man shall fly from his brother, and he's referring to the judgment here, and his mother and his father, and his spouse and his son, every man on them shall on that day have an affair with which will occupy him. Many faces on that day shall be bright, laughing, joyous, and many faces on that day on them shall be dust. Darkness shall cover them. These are they who are unbelievers, the wicked. So that was just wrapping up Surah 80, and I just wanted to point out in that Surah the distinction between how Jesus, a true prophet, but not only a prophet, but the Son of God, how he deals with people, particularly people that are afflicted with very tangible problems and suffering, and how Muhammad does. Muhammad turns away from them, and and one of the reasons is because he wasn't a prophet. He was a false prophet. He had no powers, no miraculous powers, despite what Muslim tradition claims. He had no powers, but he also had no compassion, unlike Jesus, whom the Gospels repeatedly say had compassion upon these people. Muhammad had none of that, and that's why you get surahs like this, which kind of illustrates the lack of empathy and the lack of compassion, but also the distinct lack of any sort of prophetic qualities or qualities that you would associate with a messenger of God or an apostle of God. Unlike the other apostles who were able to heal people, who were endowed with these amazing spiritual gifts, Muhammad had none of that. In fact, he couldn't even prevent his own grisly death. Um, but that is Surah 80, and I see that David Wood is streaming, so I'm probably going to wrap up now. But thanks everyone for coming, Scott, Irene, uh, MVD, Drumbo. Um, yeah, that's the thing. There are conflicting. According to tradition, it's not certain whether or not he was a Muslim. You would infer that he wasn't a Muslim just based on this surah, but there are conflicting traditions, so it's not certain. But whether or not he was a Muslim or not, it just shows Muhammad's lack of empathy and the fact that he wasn't really a prophet, because these things, just like when people came to him with questions and he developed these revelations that were obviously post hoc created justification for whatever behavior he wanted to engage in. This is just another example of the fact that Muhammad was not a man of God and certainly not a messenger of God. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. You can go over to the David stream now, but I'll be back next time with Surah 81, the covering up